Hello and welcome. My name is Charles. I go by Bob. I am not your typical painter. And today I'm going to try something different. I am going to try to show you in depth how to paint a plant in a painting. With all honesty, the plant does not take up that much space in the painting itself. But this video will go to show sometimes even a small area of a painting requires a lot of attention and detail. That is if you're trying to do representational work. But it'll be very helpful to know if this is content that people are actually interested in, because this video did take a while to edit and do a voiceover, and I hope most of you will find it helpful. So please leave a comment letting me know if I should do more in-depth videos on how to paint certain things such as fur, a plant, or certain textures. If you have any suggestions, let me know, and I'll work on it. But anyhow, let's get started with the video. This is a zoom up of the photo I am using, and I'm going to try to make colors that I see in abundance first. And I like some of these colors right here, these darker reds, these darker blues, and then there's some bright greens and some yellows. But one very important thing I want to point out is a yellow is not a yellow, a green is not a green, and a red is not a red. There's a lot of colors that go into making those tones. And besides the leaves, one way to make plants believable, which is the stems and the vines. I'm not sure if there are stems and vines, but they interconnect that way. And the other thing is the importance of light. As you can see, the sun is blazing on some, and in some it's not. And the other thing, since you are an artist, you have the liberty to get rid of noise. And what I mean by noise is stuff like this right here and this right here. You want to focus on the big shapes such as these, things like this. And I will be honest, I did not copy the photo 100%. And keep in mind, I'm working on a small canvas too. It's only 11 by 14. So that's a lot of detail to cram in a small area. To bring you up to speed, I am showing a time-lapse video of how I got to where I'm going to show you today. Of course, I painted the background first because the plant stands out in front of everything. So that included the bars, the concrete, and a window behind. But the important thing I want to point out is I kind of laid out a foundation of the plant first. Kind of like a skeleton, I laid out the vines and major leaves to kind of guide myself on how to paint this complicated little section. Also a note, I'm a slow painter, and for the duration of the video, it's actually 3 times the speed that's being portrayed, and I edit out sections where I pause and mix color. Anyway, let's get on with it. One of the things I'm trying to do when painting leaves is get a clear distinction of light and dark. So I pay attention to the photo and I try to capture all the lights and darks in big shapes first. And sometimes it's not just one solid color, it's multiple colors on the same side of a leaf, either from a cast in shadow or from a fold that the leaf makes. Also, I tried to get a clear distinction between the leaves. I achieved this by painting the rim of the leaf. But these leaves are not complete straight lines. There are little ridges. If it helps, sometimes paint the outside of the leaf and then paint within. But the edges are very important because they separate 2 different bodies of color. And in this situation, it's 2 different leaves or more in a clustered area. I also want to point out that besides variations of color, there's also variations of different types of shapes of leaves. So not all lines are going to be straight, some are going to be rough, and some have little ridges and things pointing out. And it all depends on the plant you're painting. Don't be surprised if you use pinks in some of the leaves. Obviously it's not going to be pure pink, but tones of red, and in some scenarios very light. This plant I painted had many different tones of color, and red happened to be one of them. and since it was in direct sunlight, it would appear pink. I also used that same pink in the neighboring leaf, particularly on the ridges of the edge of the leaf. I don't copy the photo 100%. I also add some darks to the leaves. I boost the darkness in certain areas and increase the brightness, particularly to create a nice separation between leaves so certain areas stand out. If you want to make them pop out, you have to create that additional contrast and create very hard lines in certain areas so they stand out. Bodies of bright colors next to dark colors help establish that distinction, like this leaf that has a fold. As you paint, have an understanding how the sun reacts to the leaf and mix the shape that you will paint. Also, as mentioned earlier, the leaves are not a solid color and sometimes there's a transition from light to dark, so expect to dry brush at certain points. Light and dark plays an important role in creating those ridges and also color contrast. I looked very carefully at the photo and I tried to mimic the pattern of those ridges on the leaves. So I paired a reddish tone with a bright yellowish green side by side. I probably will repeat myself several times in this video, but I have to emphasize the separation of different bodies of colors to create the illusion of different leaves. And as mentioned before, contrast and edges will help. Here I'm painting the veins of the leaves. I'm not sure if they're veins, but to me they appear like little veins. I'm applying them, but I'm not gonna leave them as distinct. I will probably go back later to soften them a little bit so they don't stand out that much, but they are there. And some of the unusual colors that you will see sometimes in plants, they are very bluish green, like here. When you try to capture as many variations of green tones, it helps with the realism in the end. Remember, a green is not just a green. There's always other colors within it, and as an artist, you must be able to see it and paint it. Here I'm also doing the veins of the plant again. I'm laying out different shapes of color that are directional, and I will use dry brush to create the illusion of veins, so they're a little softer. After laying out the bodies of color that form the veins, I would use a dry brush to smooth them out by adding more light or dark to reshape the veins and leaf itself. Here I'm creating a vine that will connect to the rest of the plant. I'm first laying out a reddish tone color that will connect to the thicker part of the plant. As you can see, I'm first painting the shape, and later I will go and detail it by outlining the edges and probably adding some highlights. But right now I'm just adding a simple body of color to distinguish where the vine will be. But besides that, I'm also painting some of the negative space by applying the darkest green I have, which is alizarin crimson mixed with viridian. It's not in the photo that dark, but I'm adding it to help boost the separation between the background and the plant itself. Besides creating that dark, I'm also creating more outlines for the plants as I go. Again, it's to create the separation between the leaves and to create clarity among the cluster of greens. And the lights I'm using are not always just going to be a white. Sometimes it's going to be a very pale yellowish green, and sometimes titanium white with just a hint of orange to spruce up the brightness, like for this vein here. Besides painting the shapes of the plant, such as the vines and leaves, also pay attention to the negative space. More on that later. Increasing the brightness could be used for various reasons, such as the veins of the leaves, and also, as stated before, to further increase the separation between leaves. And to get the illusion of folds within the leaves, there will be darker tones next to the brighter tones. Sometimes there will be a very crisp edge if it's a clean fold, and other times it will be softer if it's a very gentle curvature. So pay attention to what kind of fold the leaf is, because there are variations of them as well. And there are also folds among the veins of a leaf as well too. Some harsh and very clean edges, and some on the softer transition. So pay attention to the photo, or if you're doing an observational painting, to the plant itself and its leaves. Here I'm showing an example of dry brushing. I had several bodies of color of different greens, and now I'm using a dry brush to create a nice smooth transition, mindful of the light and dark. Leaves have a lot of different variations on them, again because of the folds and the way light and dark reacts to them. And there's several points I will go back again and again to redo certain sections, and it's usually to improve the separation between each leaf. As you see, I brightened some of these leaves with a more cadmium yellow mixture, and I'm adding some darkness to separate the background again here. And as a reminder, I'm not just gonna brighten things, I will also dull things out too, and that is to make them recede. So in a way, it's the reverse when you do that. Soft edges and less contrast. It's good to do that when it's the leaves that are receding or more into the background and you don't want them to stand out. While it's good to make some pop out, it's also good to make some recede, especially if you're trying to get an illusion of 3D depth, even if it's a few inches in the picture plane. I will have to say that one of the biggest challenges doing the plant in this painting is the size. Actually, it is a small section of the painting, but this just goes to show how much attention can go sometimes where most will consider the negative space, but in this scenario I'm making the negative space, the plant, have as much, if not more importance than the cat, since it's up close. But the eyes of the cat will definitely be a different story. As you paint the leaves, don't feel shame if you have to adjust them and make them bigger or smaller. Obviously, you're gonna have to use part of the negative space color in order to decrease the size of the leaves. But if you're trying to make them bigger, just apply more paint and increase the size of the leaf to make it bigger. Outlining again helps because it creates a border of separation between other leaves. But one important thing, try not to make the outlines look too much like a coloring book where the outlines are thick and stand out in a bad way. Using different colors and different levels of contrast and a variation of soft and hard edges in the right places eliminates that look of a clean cutout outline. And pay attention very carefully to the photo or the plant itself if you're doing an observational painting to see what kind of color the edges are sometimes and how hard or soft they are. This one leaf right here was kind of tricky because there was folds, veins, and that created some darkness in the center, and the tip of it was very lit from direct sunlight. To be honest, I'm not satisfied with this leaf, and most likely I will go back into it. When doing small sections like this, it helps to have very tiny brushes to get in there, whether it's to apply paint or do very tiny dry brushing. In ways, I sometimes feel like a surgeon holding a scalpel and trying to be as precise as possible with a steady hand when painting details like these leaves on this plant. Here's an example where instead of making an outline, you have to paint the sunlight around the leaf. Also, sometimes the edges of a leaf are not going to be a crisp line. Sometimes it's going to be the brightness of the sunlight dulling them out, like these leaves here towards the middle bottom. I outlined them first with a bright green, which is a lot of titanium white, and then I dry brushed from the edge to the center. I darkened some of the leaves that recede so the ones on top pop out more and help establish an illusion of depth. Here I'm painting again some of the receding leaves, and I'm not as focused on the detail as I am trying to make the other ones stand out more. So I'm using more muted colors, but I am darkening those leaves around the area where the edges meet the leaves that stand out more. Believe it or not, some of the leaves that play an important role in the painting are the ones that recede. There's not much detail that will need to go into them, but definitely paint them by showing some sort of shape in the background so there's an illusion of depth. And in order to make them recede, consider darkening them next to the ones that stand out a little, even if it goes against the photo, because you're not copying reality, you're creating an illusion of reality. So use all your tricks at your disposal to create that illusion of depth. I know I talk about doing leaves a lot in this video, but let me get back to actually painting the vines. Vines are not exactly a solid color like earlier where I just laid out a color. There's more to them. They are cylinders after all, therefore they are very round for the most part. So to create the illusion of roundness, remember there's some highlights and some darkness at the edges and color in between. And sometimes the vines match the color of the leaves. For example, these red ones that I'm painting and the leaves on the tip. And when they're clearly visible to the viewer, you must make sure they look like they actually do connect and not just randomly painted. I mentioned this before in older videos, but painting is a constant form of correction. So don't be surprised as you're painting, you're constantly correcting leaves or vines by tweaking the colors a little, the edges, or creating more division between the other leaves and vines by making some stand out more and some recede. Like these vines, I wanted them to stand out a little more, so I'm increasing the richness of the red. In order to make that red leaf stand out more, I'm increasing the darkness of the edge so it pops out from the leaves that recede, and also increasing the brightness on one of the leaves that's there as well. That way there's that contrast that creates that division and separation. I would go back also into the centers of those colors to add things such as veins and folds and little highlights of light if the sun is hitting them. But the important thing is to establish those bold colors, so in the end you don't just have a bunch of clusters of color and actually have the illusion of leaves. Some of the leaves in the negative space are not dull and dark, hidden them or not. And sometimes, even though the sunlight is hitting those leaves, there's some detail that is somewhat faintly visible. So in ways, there's a variety of things you need to try to look into capturing when trying to do a painting that is representational. Whether it's vines, ridges, or just little highlights. And this leaf here, I'm increasing the darkness of it. Since it's not in direct sunlight, I'm using a green that's more of a mixture of blue versus yellow, and a slightly brighter tone of green on the lip that recedes. And then I dry brush to make a nice smooth transition between colors. And the vines nearby recede a little more, so they're not going to stand out that much like the ones on the top left. But I am painting them so there's a connection between the leaves and the rest of the plant. Again, edges. Sometimes, even on the dark leaves, there's some bright edges. And just like most of the other leaves, ridges. To get the appearance of those ridges, it's a bright color next to a dark color, side by side. But it depends on lighting on how dark or light you make those ridges. In this situation, the sun is hitting them. Going back to negative space, it's also important to paint the background early before you do the foreground. The plant is in the foreground. Earlier I painted the bars and some sort of window in the background. Depending on your painting, you might have to go back into it, unless it's a dark painting where you could take a shortcut by just applying darks in the negative space. in ways the negative space is more complex than a dark background, but I don't mind. I like challenges. As you can see, I am applying a neutral yellow, and for the leaf that's behind it, it's even more neutral, and I neutralized it by adding red and orange to dull out the greenish yellow. If it helps, you could use neutral colors such as burnt sienna, burnt umber, or yellow ochre, but I prefer making my own. If you haven't checked out my how to make green video, you'll see that's one of the examples I make when you add yellow or red to the different ranges of greens. And this will probably be the last leaf I will talk about. As you can see, I'm using a very dark green, which is probably a mixture of Viridian and Alizarin Crimson, to do the outline first, and I'm paying attention to the ridges that exist on the leaf. I'm also painting the darker neutral reddish green leaf that's next to it as well, and some of the negative space. Like mentioned before in the video, the idea is to create a separation among all the clusters of green. Anyway, I don't want to bore you guys with me talking consistently and painting very slowly. The rest of the footage is a lot faster, but I do want to point out some things before the end of the video, and the things that I want as key takeaways, if anything. The first step is the background, because you're gonna have to paint the plant on top of a background. After the background, work on building a foundation, whether it's vines or specific leaves that stand out. And then from there, that's where you go with the detail. And the detail is gonna be the hardest part, where it's gonna be very time consuming if you're trying to do representational work. You could also draw out with a pencil or charcoal the leaves in detail prior to the painting. You could, if you want, do a massive grid. Also, the larger you go, the easier it is to cram detail. Sadly for me, I'm doing a small painting. Or use a projector if you want to accurately draw out the leaves before you start painting. Me, I don't draw, I paint. But I'm not gonna say limit yourself. It's just how I paint. But the most important thing I want to state is making sense of a cluster of colors. And that is the biggest takeaway of the whole video. And you do that by edges, colors, contrast. That way you create separation among the different leaves, especially if you want them to stand out. But if you want them to recede, it's the reverse. Less contrast, dull out the edges, and push them back into the background. Remember, you're not copying reality, you're trying to create an illusion of reality and create a sense of depth on a 2D surface. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. And also, if you found this video very helpful, please let me know in the comments. It'll let me know if I should continue doing longer, in-depth videos such as this one. Oh yeah, check out my Instagrams too. Not Your Typical Painter and Not Your Typical Photos if you want to see more of my work. Anyhow, once again, my name is Charles. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. Thanks for watching.